All right, good morning. Welcome to our Mitigating the Impact of Disaster presentation. Look forward to working with you to talk through the various considerations that go into preparing for disaster. You know, disasters come in many forms, and while we've typically thought of them in the context of weather events, brownouts of electrical utilities and so forth, we're finding that security is actually posing a significant threat as well and can be responsible for disaster type situations too. And today we'll be walking through the various steps necessary to prepare your environment to respond to and recover from such an event. My name is Chad Fenske. I'm a technical consultant with eGroup who specializes in data protection topics. I am joined today by Scott Cave, with whom I've had the privilege of partnering over a number of years. Scott is a quite experienced business continuity professional and leads Verizon's business continuity practice. Scott, I'll give you just a quick minute to say hello.
Yeah, hi everyone. Again, Scott Cave. I am a certified business continuity professional. I've been developing and delivering business continuity services and solutions for over 20 years now. And as Chad said, lead our BCDR consulting practice here at Verizon. So pleasure to join you all this morning.
All right, very good. Thank you, Scott. And it's a pleasure to have you aboard to join me for this presentation. So today's agenda is going to cover a broad range of material. We're going to talk a bit initially about preparing for disaster and what it takes to effectively do so, and then drill down into some of the detailed steps surrounding that, including how to go about defining recovery objectives, analyzing risk posed to the environment, both operational and technical, the process for developing the recovery plans to recover both the organization and the technology, how to go about implementing the recovery infrastructure, particularly in support of the technical capabilities that the organization is providing. And then we will also share, Scott and I will share with you some of the lessons that we've learned through our various years of experience out in the field. And I think you'll find that to be some valuable counsel. At the end of the presentation, and certainly during the course of the presentation, feel free to ask any questions that come to mind. We'll be monitoring the chat as well as monitoring audio for your cues. So I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that disasters are occurring really all the time. Shown here on the diagram in the upper right, we see that there were a number of significant disasters throughout the U.S. That resulted in billion-dollar losses. And those events range from a number of different weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, intense storms, to the wildfires that have occurred out west. And of course, those various disasters are responsible for destroying quite a bit of property and so forth. But those disasters can also wreak havoc, of course, on information technology infrastructures as well. Now, this is the type of disaster that we typically think of and historically have typically prepared for when developing disaster recovery and business continuity plans. However, security events spawned by malicious actors have increasingly become a source of disaster as well. It is with great frequency that we're opening the news to find that another organization has been attacked by ransomware, and consequently their business operations have been compromised, and it could take many days, even weeks, for that organization to recover. And so that is a very serious and increasing threat for which we need to prepare. As noted in that quote down at the lower right, in 2020 alone, the Internet Crime Complaint Center received nearly 2,500 complaints of ransomware, and the losses reported due to those events were 29.1 million. But the IC3 is careful to note that this is just losses that were reported by those organizations. The actual amount of that loss has not been determined because many organizations choose to not report the financial metrics involved with those particular events. So it can be quite serious and more serious than this particular figure might indicate. So there are a number of different causes, different cases for which we need to prepare. And one of the things that Scott does is work with organizations to conduct various exercises to respond to these various threats. And Scott, what are some of the typical scenarios against which you've seen organizations prepare and actually run test drills?
Yeah, thanks, Chad. So we see customers asking for like a common group, I guess, of scenarios to run tabletop exercises, normally to address either top threats based on where they're located geographically, or top of mind threats that are, sort of prevalent in the news. So certainly we've done many tabletop exercises for hurricanes and pandemics, given where we are in 2021 here with what's going on recently. But we've also done a number for other threats over the years, bomb threats and tornadoes and active shooter. We've even done a number of cybersecurity tabletop exercises to really bring all the different players from different aspects of the organization, not just IT and not just security, but other elements of the business, to talk about what would happen if a ransomware or data breach or other type of security threat were on our doorstep, so to speak. So normally all those are really important to not only exercise the plans and develop some muscle memory in terms of what people would do, but also really kind of flesh out some of the issues and gaps and improvement opportunities within those plans.
Yeah, very good. And I think the bottom line to this discussion is that threats come in many, many different forms, and we need to be prepared to respond to those. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Even cloud-based infrastructures are not immune, and there are preparations that one will want to make, even if your services happen to be running in a cloud-based service, such as Microsoft Azure. So there is a very well-defined methodology by which to go through and prepare for a disaster. And there are really two major components associated with that. The first is business continuity planning, which deals with the process of resuming business functions. Basically, how do you get the various departments involved in your organization back up and productive and performing the functions for which they're responsible? The second element to that is addressing the technical infrastructure that supports those business processes. And that's accomplished through the disaster recovery planning process, in which plans are developed to restore various systems, applications, communication services back to operation so that the various facets of the organization have the technology they need to do their jobs effectively. The process really begins with a business impact analysis in which the recovery timelines for all the various systems and even the functions themselves are identified. Those recovery objectives are based upon the impact of not being able to perform those functions, the impact that has on the business itself. And those impacts can range from actual financial impact to reputational impact, a reputational loss, a reputation loss that one would suffer in the public eye if something were to go awry within the organization. And we actually work with a number of public organizations for whom public scrutiny is very tight, and consequently that reputational loss is a significant factor in their assessment of impact. From there, we work to identify the various risks that are posed to the organization. That includes just operational risk to the business itself, ranging from the various threats that we discussed earlier, to the actual technical risk present within the current technical infrastructure, ranging from possible security threats to loss of equipment or loss of access to a particular service. Equipped with the objectives and the various risks posed, we can then set about developing a plan to mitigate those risks or otherwise prepare for recovering if one of those particular threats should materialize. And that plan development includes building a business continuity plan for restoring the organization to operation, and then a disaster recovery plan for restoring the technical infrastructure to operation. With those plans developed, we can then set about implementation of those plans, which includes not only just deploying the technical infrastructure, which is an obvious one, but also deploying the required policies and procedures that enable the organization to effectively respond to those threats when they occur. Then, of course, it's always advisable to practice as you expect to play. And so testing is an important part of the process, testing both the business continuity plan and the disaster recovery plan with regularity for a couple of reasons. Number one is to ensure the organization's preparedness to spring into action when the situation arises. But then also, as importantly, to be able to uncover gaps that might not have been addressed in the original planning exercise. It could include things like little communication gaps, for example, that prevent one system from talking to another. This testing helps surface those things so that they can be addressed so that you're assured of the actual recovery proceeding with fewer glitches. And then finally, it is very important to keep those plans up to date. They are not stagnant. They are not something that gets put on the shelf and never looked at again. They are living, breathing documents that must be maintained with regularity. We recommend at least quarterly frequency, and then certainly anytime a significant change occurs as well. So all of these various activities are essential to being prepared to properly address a disaster, with that business impact analysis setting the baseline of what services must be provided if such a disaster were to occur. On this particular slide, we see the more comprehensive methodology, a more comprehensive view of the methodology that we employ. The business impact analysis, beginning with collecting information from the various business units, assessing the impact, and then translating that into recovery time and recovery objectives, both for the business units itself as well as the technology that supports it. Performing the risk analyses, both of the organization and the technical risk. For the disaster recovery strategy and plan, we will often begin with the development of a reference architecture, which is a more general specification of the functional capabilities that need to be provided, independent of equipment from any particular vendor. That can then be refined into a system specification, which calls out the very specific technologies that will be implemented to construct the infrastructure environment. Another important aspect of that is the facility strategy. So determining where the services are going to be recovered, whether that might be an on-premises location, a hosted facility, or even a secondary cloud region. And then finally, putting into place the policies and procedures necessary to actually invoke those technologies to failover operations to that disaster recovery environment. And then I'll ask Scott to talk a bit about the various facets of the business continuity planning process.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. So very similarly, that business impact analysis you see at the top of the page there is really the foundation for both tracks, if you will, the DR track and the business continuity track. So the information comes out there feeding business continuity would include things like what are the critical processes and what are their dependencies in terms of certainly technology, but also vendors and staffing and resources and equipment and so forth and so on. So we have all of the requirements really to start building some business continuity strategies and plans. And that usually falls into three categories, as you see here. We have some preparation activities that need to be done initially, as well as on an ongoing basis, maybe annually or possibly even more frequently. Then we have some response activities that start off our initial activation of the business continuity plan, followed by some recovery activities as well to kind of close out the loop. All that is also informed by the risk assessment, the organizational risk assessment, which helps to identify what are the top threats that we need to plan for, what are the top risks associated with those threats, and those can cover for communications and facilities. We'll talk about more of those actually in just a minute. But all of that information helps to inform what we should be planning for and how we put those plans together within the business continuity plan. And then, as Chad said, once the plan is written, A good plan is never a good plan until it's tested, right? It's really just a theoretical plan at first. So we go through an implementation phase, and then we go through a testing phase to really start preparing teams to use the plan appropriately, to simulate different types of scenarios, as we talked about previously, can run the gamut from natural disasters, man-made, and technology, and everything else in between. And then we start to evaluate how we performed during those exercises. And eventually we'll have some real world activations that also provide us an opportunity to do some after action reporting to identify gaps, identify improvement opportunities. So it becomes an iterative process where you're always in the process of updating the plan, maintaining the plan, and maintaining people's readiness to activate the plan effectively when needed.
Very good, Scott. Thank you. And from a technical standpoint, the testing process most frequently involves an actual failover of services to the selected disaster recovery venue, and then bringing those back into the production environment. And through that process, uncovering various technical limitations or other little tweaks that need to be made to ensure that those failover and failback processes can be most effectively carried out. And the evaluation process involved in that testing is all about surfacing those lessons learned and putting plans in action to remedy any particular issues that were encountered, so that the testing proceeds more cleanly the next time, and so that an actual recovery event has the greatest chance of succeeding as well. And of course, the ongoing maintenance is essential to keeping those plans up to date. So we're going to drill down into each of these phases in just a little bit more depth here, though we've certainly covered quite a bit of the material thus far in our discussion. But I do want to take this opportunity to stress that we can meet you anywhere you happen to be on this particular continuum. Perhaps you've invested in a business impact analysis recently or even within the last few years, and simply need to brush that up and ensure that recovery objectives are refreshed to reflect the current state of the environment. It's quite possible that hasn't been conducted at all, and that's okay. We can get started from that square one if needed as well. You might have actually implemented a bit of disaster recovery capability as well, with replication of data being written to another facility or backups going off-site, but are interested in improving upon those capabilities so that you can meet tighter recovery objectives. We can begin work there as well in helping you flesh out what improvements need to be made within that disaster recovery environment. Maybe you've actually gone through a lot of the planning process and you simply need some help in facilitating testing exercises and ensuring that the plans are maintained moving forward so that they don't become that binder that sits on the shelf gathering dust. We can help you out with those activities as well. All right, I'm going to turn over to Scott to address the business impact analysis, the various facets of that, and how we translate business impact into recovery time and recovery point objectives.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. So the business impact analysis, again, foundational item. It's really important to make sure you have this well documented and updated. If it's been a few years or more since you've last done this activity, great opportunity to kind of start here, right, to refresh your entire plan and program. Because the output of the business impact analysis provides critical foundational items for your planning efforts and your overall plans. Normally, if you were to ask some of your constituents and stakeholders how much downtime they can tolerate, whether it's downtime from business processes or technology or anything in between, the typical emotional response is zero, right? Most people say we cannot tolerate any downtime. And of course, it is possible to plan for zero downtime, but very difficult to achieve because it's extremely expensive to develop those highly available plans across your entire organization. It certainly might be more appropriate for selected critical systems. So the way we kind of get around the emotional response to that question is the business impact analysis. Instead of asking that question, we start at the business process or business function level by interviewing each department And we ask them simply, what are the impacts to the business if this function cannot be performed? What are the impacts to you operationally, to financially, reputationally, maybe from a compliance or regulatory standpoint, maybe to your customers or whoever your stakeholders are? And we go across all those categories and we start to define what do those impacts look like and how do those impacts scale over time? Or when do they reach their maximum tolerance at a certain time? So those help us to really provide a much more objective, both a quantitative and qualitative approach that provides very rich data to develop recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives that are more objectively determined and are supported by some solid data from the business. And that's important for two reasons. One is it makes sure that we have appropriate recovery targets established, again, that your entire plans and program are going to be developed upon. But also, if you need to invest further resources or money to actually implement these plans, which is often the next step, especially on the disaster recovery side, but oftentimes within business continuity as well, then you already have some data that helps to justify why those additional resources and funds may be necessary to mitigate some of the impacts and some of the risks that have been identified as a result of the business impact analysis. So again, those outputs, you see the terms at the bottom here: recovery time objective, recovery point objective. The first one, RTO, simply means the amount of downtime for either a business function, a technology application supporting systems, or even for supporting vendors that is tolerable to achieve a goal or to achieve to to prevent an intolerable amount of impact to the business, right? So recovery time objective, how much downtime we can tolerate before that significant impact occurs to the business. Recovery point objective is much more technology focused. It's really the tolerable amount of data loss associated with an application or a system. So how much data loss can we tolerate? It really defines how often we should be backing up that particular system or application. And once you gather all that data, you analyze it, you collate it, and you start to put it into a form that can be digested by the business. It looks something like on the right side of the screen here. We normally assign tiers to the information to group them together by that RTO metric. And then we simply list the departments and functions, and you do something very similar for applications and technology that group them together by tier and are prioritized from the shortest time frame up to the longest time frame. And you typically see starting at very short time frames of an hour or two and extending all the way out to very long time frames of 1 month or more. But again, really important foundational information that'll drive the rest of the program. And of course, if the foundation is weak, we don't have good data here, you can expect that the rest of the plans and programs that you're building upon may also be weak as well. So that's why it's important for us to revisit this BIA or business impact analysis regularly to update it as well. Chad, if we can go to the next slide, please. So oftentimes the business impact analysis leads to a risk assessment. Sometimes these activities are done in parallel and sometimes they're done sequentially, but they're normally done somewhat in tandem because they provide a total picture of risk across the organization. There is some risk that comes out of a business impact analysis, but really the risk assessment, especially on the organizational side, is probing deeper to look at all the threats that could impact that organization and starting to look at the magnitude, the probability, and the extent of those impacts to the organization. And then we also look at what are the resulting risks from those threats. And we start to categorize those into different buckets oftentimes around life safety operations and physical facilities. And sometimes there can be some other groups as well. But these are three of the more common ones. And we start to evaluate and assess those across different characteristics. So you see over here on the right side an example of an output of an organizational risk assessment. We have a number of different risks on the left side. And of course, it's helpful to prioritize or to rank them somehow. And we do that by the assessment on the right side. We look at the probability of each risk occurring based on our threat analysis, as well as the risk assessment itself. We look at the potential impact to the business. And then we look at the controls that are in place to mitigate each of those risks today. right? So for internal communications, we may have redundant communication methods. We may have, phones and all sorts of other emergency systems in place that do a great job of mitigating that particular risk. So the likely impact may be different. Or in some cases, we may not have any mitigating controls in place today. So therefore, the likely impact in this particular example is the same as the potential impact. But the likely impact helps to assess the degree to which the current controls in place are effective in mitigating that particular risk. And then the risk severity really just rolls up all those previous three factors into an overall risk severity factor that we use to then prioritize or rank these different risks at an organizational level. And this is really important because over time, organizations really need to look at the risk assessment and the results of the risk assessment to understand where they should prioritize some additional resources to mitigate their top vulnerabilities resulting from this risk assessment. And every time we deliver this type of report to a customer, they're very interested in understanding what those top risks are and what the recommendations are resulting from that they can use to address those top risks. And normally we see people taking quick action on those top risks within several months, and then revisit it and take another pass at it and start to look at those medium risks, and then maybe a couple years later we'll reevaluate and see if those low risks are still low or if there are other ones that have popped up in between. But as a high level, this really provides a good understanding of where those vulnerabilities exist at the organizational level. And now let me turn it over to Chad to talk about the technology risk assessment.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. The process that we invoke on behalf of the technical environment is very similar with the same probability, potential impact, likely impact, and risk severity approach to determining those areas that in which the organization is most vulnerable. But the technical risk assessment, as the name would imply, really focuses on the technology that is supporting the organization. And we address a variety of different disciplines, IT disciplines, with that risk assessment, ranging from security, which is increasingly top of mind for every organization, and rolling on through the network infrastructure and its resilience and fault tolerance, the servers that are supporting the various applications, and even the availability characteristics of the application itself, the underlying storage on which data associated with those applications is housed, and the protection methods that are employed to ensure that that data is safeguarded from loss. And then the facilities that are in place housing the infrastructure as it is maintained today, whether that is an actual physical on-premises data center, a hosted facility by a co-location provider, or actually a cloud provider as well. In the case of an organization whose computing infrastructure might already reside within the cloud, this risk assessment is still quite valuable and applicable because those vendors are also faced with very similar challenges. And so it's important to understand how they handle and respond to security threats. It's important to understand the redundancy that exists among the data centers in which they're housing your critical assets. So all of these factors that we would study on behalf of an organization's own in-house data center, we also study for an organization whose infrastructure happens to reside up in the cloud. And then, based upon the results of this technical assessment, we have a very good idea of the various additional controls that need to be put in place to eliminate points of risk, or enhancements to existing controls that will help further mitigate risk or otherwise better enable one's ability to recover from a particular event. Once we have studied those various risks, we can then begin to map out the business continuity plan, first of all, for returning the organization to operation. Scott, if you would, please take us through that planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the left side of the screen here, you really see the outputs from all the activities we've described to date, the business impact analysis, the risk assessment for the organizational side. Again, very useful inputs into the planning process for essential functions and their recovery time objective, for staffing, minimum staffing levels. Can we tolerate for a week or two? Maybe we have 20 people doing a certain activity. normally, but can we tolerate only having 10 or 5 or whatever number for that sort of minimum period following a disruption or a disaster? So that helps to inform our planning. What resources, alternate facilities, telecom, technology, other resources are available and required, as well as some strategies that we've discovered and discussed with the different departments to really ensure continuity of each function. So once we've gathered all that information in the previous phases, now we're ready to sit down and actually write our business continuity plans. So they typically fall around three different areas. Crisis management is really the first one. That's very critical because crisis management really is the starting point and the umbrella for everything that we do during an activation of our business continuity plan. There's a crisis management team that would often involve key selected representatives of key areas of the organization that work together throughout the crisis from start to finish. They meet regularly, they discuss everything that's going on, they establish priorities, and they start to take direction and make decisions about how we're going to respond and which other plans we're going to activate in response to the evolution of this crisis event, whatever it may be. So that also includes a crisis management plan that kind of guides that process of how they're going to meet and how they're going to make decisions and who's involved in all those different processes and what that battle rhythm that I call looks like, how often they're going to do those things, who else needs to be involved, what are the inputs and outputs of all those processes. So really important part of the crisis management process, followed very closely by crisis communications plan. How are we going to communicate effectively throughout a crisis internally amongst this team? How are we going to communicate effectively to all of our employees and staff and inform them of what's going on and what's expected and what's being asked of them in response to whatever the crisis event is? How are we going to communicate effectively to our constituents, our customers, and the public and the media as well? All of those things are covered within that crisis communications plan, and it takes into consideration we may not have normal lines of communication available. So what are those emergency or backup systems or communication methods that we can use in addition to the standard ones? It also looks at the social media impact. That's part of crisis, an increasing part of crisis communications today. Who's monitoring social media to kind of monitor and respond if necessary, or at least gather intel about what people are saying about our company, our brand, and our ongoing response to this crisis event. Another important component of the crisis communications plan. Then we move into the response plans, and the response plans address specific types of response scenarios. So every business with 10 or more employees, according to OSHA, must have a written emergency action plan. How are we, and it's really about life safety. How are we going to keep people safe during events that would threaten their life safety, their personal safety? So things like fires and tornadoes and earthquakes and floods and so forth and so on, active shooters and all of those things that we hear about, we know about. How do we respond to those within the first seconds and minutes and hours after event to make sure people are safe and we have a well-organized way to account for people and respond appropriately? So all of that would be in the emergency action plan. Of course, you have other specific scenarios, pandemics, we're certainly familiar with that. How should we respond to an evolving pandemic that goes through multiple waves of activity, as we're seeing in this pandemic? And then, of course, things like a hurricane plan, which may be more regional. In your region, you may have other types of threats that are top threats for natural disasters, but those are important response plans as well. And then finally, we have recovery plans. What are the specific recovery procedures once we've responded to an event and things have stabilized? How do we get back to either a normal or a new normal, depending on the situation? So those can be department level, they can be process or function level, but normally that business impact analysis would provide us with a catalog of critical functions that need to have very specific procedures about how to recover those critical functions in the event of an emergency or crisis. And then you have other components that go along with it. You might have an alternate facilities plan, you might have an emergency staffing plan, you may even have a financial recovery plan. So there can be many other components of recovery covered here as well, but they're all designed to work in concert with and in coordination with that crisis management process from start to finish. So at a high level, that covers the business continuity planning process. And I'll turn it back over to Chad to talk about the process on the technical side.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And as Scott mentioned earlier, a lot of times the business continuity planning is taking place in parallel with the disaster recovery planning. And there are lessons learned and exchanged between Scott and me and our other practitioners as we go through and map out these various plans. Lessons learned on the business continuity side can be applied in real time to the design of the disaster recovery environment. And we will begin the disaster recovery planning process by architecting the disaster recovery environment, the solutions that will be necessary to implement failover over technical operations to a secondary location, whether that is an on-premises data center or a cloud-based service. That reference architecture is intended to satisfy the recovery time and recovery point objectives that are uncovered and defined during the business impact analysis. Those are the key drivers behind the selection of the technology that will be used to implement the disaster recovery infrastructure, and also they dictate the processes that will be invoked as well. Some key principles that we apply when architecting that disaster recovery infrastructure includes ensuring that the disaster recovery environment will provide a level of performance that's comparable to production. It might not be exactly as highly performant as the production environment, but it needs to be close because production operations might in fact be running out of that disaster recovery environment for an extended period of time, depending upon how widespread and significant the disaster happens to be. Another important consideration, and this will gain in importance for the foreseeable future, is security. And when designing that disaster recovery environment, you try to ensure that the disaster recovery environment possesses an equivalent level of security to production. We do not want to scrimp on the security controls that are put in place to safeguard that disaster recovery infrastructure. Both in terms of its normal day-to-day use, where it's usually just catching information that's being copied to it, to the scenario in which it's actually placed into production operation to support the needs of the organization. And then one of the key considerations as well is that we want to be able to test the functionality of the disaster recovery infrastructure without significant disruption to the production operations. So we put in place technologies that allow one to conduct some tests independent of what might be going on in production. But it was also important to take some time, at least annually, to actually take live production operations and run them from the disaster recovery environment, which might result, and typically does result, in a bit of disruption. And so typically that testing will be conducted during a maintenance window that's been pre-scheduled and advertised to the various dependents on the information technology infrastructure. It's depicted here on the right-hand side. You'll actually see a scenario in which disaster recovery preparations are being made on behalf of an organization whose primary infrastructure runs in the cloud. But in this particular case, the customer wanted to make sure they were in control of that recovery process, not leaving it to the cloud vendor to determine when and if they were going to bring up their own supporting disaster recovery infrastructure to mitigate the impact of loss of a particular region. And so by deploying the technologies that support those computing operations in a secondary region within that same vendor, the customer has gained control over that disaster recovery process and is in a better position to be able to ensure that systems are brought up within the recovery time and recovery point objectives defined earlier. And then a key part of implementing disaster recovery plan is preparing the financials associated with it, preparing the justification necessary to invest in the appropriate technologies. And so we at eGroup will work with our clients to translate that reference architecture into the specific system components that are to be deployed, and then assess the cost of not only initially acquiring those technologies, but then maintaining that disaster recovery infrastructure over time, typically over a 5-year period, but that period can be lengthened or shortened depending upon the justification processes associated with a given client. And you can see that through this financial picture, we attempt to account for all the various facets of the disaster recovery infrastructure that would come into play, including things like communications costs and data flowing in and out of the cloud and any charges that might be associated with that. Now, this type of financial analysis that you see here, while specifically applicable to a cloud environment, we certainly will do likewise on behalf of on-premises infrastructures and hosted disaster recovery capabilities as well. So we're not limited to being able to provide disaster in the cloud. We can address all of the various facets of disaster recovery options. So once we have built out those disaster recovery environments, we of course go through the process of testing them regularly and help customers maintain the documentation associated with the plans, both business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans. And through our living with the engagement, defining what's to be done, testing it, and maintaining it over time, we've learned a lot of different lessons through our experiences. And Scott, I'll let you address that first one there, which is the importance of proactively preparing as opposed to reacting to disaster.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. I mean, I like the way this is written, proactive planning versus reactive scrambling, because I think that really captures sort of the essence of what we're talking about here. Obviously, everything we've discussed today is on the proactive side, right? It takes a proactive stance, and it really helps move an organization from a reactive posture to a proactive posture. And I think that's a really critical shift to make throughout this entire process of developing these plans and really a sustainable program long term. But one example I've seen with one particular example in mind is a customer who was responding to a hurricane and had a hurricane plan in place, but hadn't updated it recently, and found themselves more in this reactive scrambling process with one particular component. They were trying to gather all the information, all the contact information for all their employees as they were making their plans to evacuate and go to various places. And they had over 1,000 employees, and they were sending around the spreadsheet to all 1,000 employees within maybe 4 or 5 days of the expected hurricane's landfall. And you can imagine what that process was like. It did not go well at all. They did not capture the information they needed. And as a result, they had a hard time kind of keeping track of where people were and who was available to work and who wasn't. And it led to the recognition that we need to make sure, one, that we need to update our plans, and two, we need to start doing this type of activity maybe back when hurricane season begins rather than right before the hurricane makes landfall at our doorstep. So that proactive mindset is really important to maintain, not just throughout the planning process, but ongoing throughout the entire program life cycle, to make sure that we're always in that proactive posture to respond effectively and appropriately.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Scott. There is nothing like being prepared and practicing those plans repeatedly. And that second item there, test, is one of the most important bits of counsel that we can impart to you. It is incredibly important to make sure that you're routinely running through various recovery scenarios so that the skills are maintained throughout the organization, and in particular on behalf of those individuals who bear the heaviest burden in making sure that technical infrastructure, for example, is up and running, ensuring that the decision makers are evaluating all the factors and making wise decisions when it comes to actually invoking the disaster recovery plans. And basically, again, as I mentioned earlier, practicing in the manner in which you hope to play when the actual event arises. We deal with a number of organizations who might have actually invested in crafting a plan many years ago, but they have neglected to test it for a number of years. And that's a shame, because at this point, it's probable that that plan is outdated, and the team is likely to meet with some significant challenges from having not frequently tested and kept that plan up to date, which is actually the third bit of counsel, which is it's incredibly important to keep that plan documentation current as things change. This is applicable to both the business continuity plans and the disaster recovery plans. The organization's constantly changing. Technology underpinnings are frequently changing as well. And so it's important that the plans be kept up to date to reflect those changes so that when the time comes and one actually has to invoke this in a real scenario, the plans are there and reflective of the best practices for that moment in time to address the current state of the environment. And then I'll ask Scott to weigh in on this last one as well, but I'll tee it up with when testing in particular, and then for that matter, during a recovery scenario as well, don't expect things to run perfectly. In a testing scenario, when things do go awry, those are actually some opportunities to learn some valuable lessons on tweaks and improvements that can be made to the disaster recovery infrastructure itself or to the processes to ensure that in an actual event, the environment is better prepared to facilitate the functionality that is needed. And the same goes for organizational planning as well. There are times where one might stumble, but it's it's important to be able to learn the lessons that arise from that and be able to make changes to the plans and processes to accommodate that. Scott, let me ask you to weigh in on those last few as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chad. So I think, as you said, my key observation here is that over time, plans become more flexible and more adaptable. So initially, as you develop your plans, you might develop one or two strategies or options to recover certain components, technology and facilities and communications and maybe a few alternate vendors for key vendors and so forth. But over time, what we see is those tend to grow and expand because you realize that the one option you had or the two options you had didn't work during the real activation or during the test as you expected. So you had to come up with another option. So that one helps to develop some flexibility in your approach. Not every event, certainly most of them don't go exactly according to plan. So we have to learn how to use the framework of the plan to adapt and to be flexible with the changing and maybe unexpected things that often occur with actual activations. But again, as we learn these things, we tend to develop more options and more capabilities within the plans moving forward so that you might have 5 years from now a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C for recovering a certain component where you might have only started with a plan A, initially. So developing those options, developing that flexibility, and developing that adaptive mindset is a really important output of the testing maintenance process for sure.
Yeah, very good, Scott. The testing process and the issues that might arise during it are a particularly good opportunity to equip the team to really think on their feet and be able to address situations that could very well happen in a real scenario and be prepared to address those and maintain a cool, level-headed approach to working the issue, working the problem, making smart decisions, and ultimately getting through it. All right. Well, let me open up the floor here to any questions that you might have. If you have a question, feel free to just speak up, or you can click the little raised hand icon, and we'll call on you. I'll give just a few seconds. If there are no questions, we'll wrap up with just a quick review of my contact information, Scott's contact information. So if you do think of something that you'd like to explore in more depth in the future, you know how to get in touch with us. First of all, any questions from the audience here today? All right, very good. Well, as I mentioned, we have a number of methods by which we can help you out with your disaster recovery preparedness. Anywhere on that continuum that we reviewed, whether it's beginning with that business impact analysis and figuring out the criticality of various functions and applications, to just improving upon the disaster recovery infrastructure or putting in place, developing the run books that actually walk you through the procedures to carry out disaster recovery. We can help you with any of that, and Scott and I would be more than happy to work with you to do so. I can be reached at the email address cited there, chad.fenske@egroup-us.com. Scott is available at scott.cave@verizon.com. Please don't hesitate to drop us a note If you've got any questions about our processes, or if you have an actual need that you'd like to discuss further, we'd be happy to work with you, see where you are, and see what needs to be done to help put you in a better position to mitigate the impact of disaster and ultimately recover successfully from that event. Very much appreciate your attention today and look forward to working with you in the future. Take care.